As you know, great treatment advances have been made, allowing people living with HIV to live near normal life expectancies. However, people living with HIV continue to experience disproportionate rates of mental health issues. Anxiety and depression remain significant obstacles to HIV care and HIV health. To shed light on this topic, we have two excellent speakers with us, Dr. Jennifer Wide and former Positive Living Chair Lynn Townsend.
Oh, yes.
Please help us welcome them. Wonderful. Okay, so at this time, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Jennifer Wide from St. Paul IDC. And she will be presenting from a clinical perspective on this topic. Jennifer is a staff psychiatrist and a clinical instructor based at St. Paul's Hospital. After completing graduate studies in neuroscience, she studied medicine at UBC with her residency training having a special focus in the areas of HIV and youth mental health. She further is certified by the American Board of Addiction Medicine. On completion of her residency, she joined the Infectious Disease Clinic in a consultant role, in addition to general psychiatry and patient care. She furthermore works with marginalized youth via outreach through the inner city youth mental health program and co-facilitating a dialectical behavioral therapy program. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wide.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. First off, thank you very much for inviting me to speak this evening on a very important topic. This is such a vast topic that I really had to try hard to limit what I was going to say, and I'm going to have to talk in some broad strokes. I think anxiety and depression, I could probably spend hours talking about each of them individually, but I'm going to try to narrow things down. I've made a choice to talk mainly about depression. I am going to touch on anxiety. And there's a few reasons for focusing on depression. So in 2013, in the States, they conducted a survey called the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And they looked at the American population, and they determined that in a 12-month period, that about 15.7 million Americans experienced major depression. We had a similar study here in Canada, conducted by Statistics Canada, and it was done in 2012. And it was called the Canadian Community Mental Health Survey. And what they found is, for the Canadian population, in a 12-month period, about 4.7% of the population experienced major depression. So, fairly significant. And when they looked at the lifetime prevalence of major depression, they determined that about 20% of the Canadian population would at some point in their life experience major depression. That's 1 in 5 individuals. So it's, again, fairly significant. And what makes this significant is the burden of disease. So the World Health Organization has these markers to determine burden of disease. And one of them is called the daily adjusted life years, or DALYs. And what it is calculating, what this marker indicates, is how many years are lost due to the illness itself, disability related to illness, or early death. And depression is the 4th leading cause of DALYs. It's the leading cause of years of life lived with disability. So it's quite significant. And not only, when we talk about burden, you know, there's the effects on the individual, there's effects on the relationship, there's effects on employment, there's effects on the healthcare system. So it's fairly significant. Yeah. Now, between the years of 1994 to 2000, there was a survey done called the HIV Cost and Utilization Survey. And it looked at 2,864 individuals living with HIV. And it determined that the 12-month prevalence for depression in the HIV population is 36%. So general population 4.7, individuals living with HIV 36%. So that's quite significant. There's a few reasons why individuals experience major depression. I'm going to talk about some of the reasons in the general population and some of the reasons that are specific to the positive community. So starting with genetics. So in 2003, researcher Capsey and colleagues, he published an article in Science, which is a pretty prestigious journal. And what he was looking at is, are there any kind of genetic determinants of depression? Or any kind of genetic markers that would indicate that someone would go on to have depression? And what he looked at was the serotonin receptor. So I'm going to get a little scientific for a moment here. So a lot of you might know that serotonin is thought to have a role to play in depression, and a lot of individuals don't have enough serotonin in the brain, and we often have to kind of top it up in order to treat depression. So I thought, well, this is a good spot to kind of start looking. So they looked at the transporter gene, and they found out that there's actually two variants to the transporter gene. There's what they call a short allele and a long allele, okay? And they first looked and they said, well, if someone has the short versus long, does that lead to a higher risk of depression? When they looked at those, they said, well, no, there was no difference between the two. But interestingly enough, when they took those individuals and they looked at their background and how much trauma they had had, particularly in childhood, they found that those individuals that have the short allele and have been exposed to trauma have more of a risk of depression. So there's this gene by kind of environment interaction. Now that study was a little bit controversial, and incidentally no one has been able to replicate that, but it was a bit of a starting point. And it's generated some talk about heritability with depression. We also know that using twin studies between identical twins, that there's about 30 to 50% heritability of major depression. And if you have a first-degree relative with depression, mother, father, brother, sister, sibling, you have 2 to 3 times the risk of having depression. So there's a genetic component to it. No one is going to question the effects of trauma and stress on depression. And in particular, individuals who've been through the HIV epidemic, the losses that they've had, the isolation that they've had, the stigma that comes with the diagnosis, that in and of itself is a huge stressor and cause significant anxiety. Another thing to talk about is drug side effects. So there are ARVs that in and of themselves can cause mood instability. So efavirenz, Sustiva. That's the one that we often talk about in psychiatry. What's unique about that ARV is that it has high central nervous system penetration. So it gets into the central nervous system, the CNS as we call it. And when it does that, it leads to a lot of mood instability, it leads to agitation. Some people will talk about, I've heard the analogy to a pop-up screen on the computer. So they'll have sudden suicidal thoughts that are ego dystonic. They're not liking them, but they kind of pop out of nowhere like a pop-up screen on a computer. Not everyone gets that. Some individuals have had that. So certainly there is an effect on mood related to that drug. I also want to talk about the inflammatory process. So early in the course of the illness, there's penetration into the central nervous system, and it usually happens around day 14 to 16. And it's thought that the way that the virus gets into the brain is through cells called macrophages. Macrophages, you can kind of think of them as the vacuum cleaners of the brain. Okay, so they gobble up all the debris. And so what happens is the virus actually infiltrates the macrophages and travels with them into the brain, kind of like a Trojan horse. And once it gets in there, it releases all these neurotoxins. This leads to a huge inflammatory process. And that is thought to cause neuron cell death. Okay. There's an area of the brain called the limbic system, which is responsible for emotions. And if we get damage to that area of the brain, we can get mood instability, agitation, lability. So there's been an interest since kind of the mid-90s on the effects of inflammation on depression. And it was this sort of sudden kind of eureka moment where it was like, oh, inflammation might be linked to depression. More recently, we think that depression also causes inflammation. So kind of feeding into each other. And depression is a predictor of HIV progression because if you're depressed, there's been studies that show that your CD4 count has a much more rapid decline. So that's pretty significant, and certainly a reason to treat depression. So, given the prevalence, given the burden, given the significant effects of this illness, why is it that we're calling it a hidden epidemic? Well, there's a few reasons for that. One reason is that about 50% of those who suffer from major depressive disorder do not report it to their caregivers. Okay? And there's probably lots of reasons for that. And no fault to them either, because we also need to sort of point fingers at the healthcare providers, because there is a tendency for clinicians to assume that depression is part of the illness. Right? Well, of course they have depression. They have a chronic condition. Right? But that kind of brings on this kind of helpless model, right? Where it's like, well, are you not treating them because you assume that that is just natural? Which isn't the case. The third reason why it might be that depression is not recognized and not treated properly has to do with the symptoms of depression itself. Now, this is a pretty dense slide. So don't worry about picking up all the details. This is just a snapshot of the diagnostic criteria for depression. So in psychiatry, we have the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, DSM, which is kind of like our Bible for diagnosing. And it certainly has its controversy, and that's a different lecture to have. So how depression is defined is that an individual has to have at least 2 weeks, if not more, of continuous symptoms. One of the symptoms has to be depression or dysphoric mood, low mood, or a loss of interest in your usual activities. So things that you get joy or pleasure from, you no longer experience that. So you have to have one of those two criteria, then you have to have 4 other criteria. Changes in sleep, changes in energy level, guilt, worthlessness, concentration problems, hopeless thoughts, or suicidality. Okay? And I'm bringing this up because I'm not training you all to be diagnosticians. I don't necessarily want you to diagnose it in yourself. But I bring this up because some of you might notice that some of those latter symptoms there, they're non-specific. I mean, if you're positive and your ARVs, maybe your viral load's up, your CD4 is down, or you're struggling, you may have a lot of those symptoms. So often what happens is clinicians go, again, oh, that's not depression, that's just part of the illness. Okay? And so when I'm seeing an individual and I'm trying to assess whether or not they have depression, what I tend to do is I separate out the symptoms. So I break them down into the psychological versus sort of somatic or physical. And I actually focus probably much more of my time and give much more weight to the affective or psychological, right? Whether they got depressed mood, loss of interest, guilt, worthlessness, or suicidal ideation. Okay. So, as a result of stigma, as a result of clinicians being maybe misguided, as a result of some overlap, what happens is it tends to be undetected, misdiagnosed, or mistreated. Okay? And that's, I think, where sort of the epidemic comes from. So, why treat? I mean, there's some obvious reasons why you'd want to treat someone. We talked about how depression itself can accelerate the disease progress. We also talked about, I mentioned one of the criteria being lack of interest in things that are normally giving you pleasure or meaning. Individuals who are depressed often are amotivated, sometimes they have apathy, what's the point? It can be incredibly impairing. And sometimes that can lead to poor medication adherence. So they stop taking their ARVs, which also leads to a higher risk of transmission. One of the other symptoms of depression that's getting a lot more interest these days is cognition. So a lot of individuals who are depressed, they'll feel like they're kind of slowed down, they're not as sort of quick thinking. When they try to watch TV, read the paper, read books, they have to kind of repeat themselves or repeat the sentence a number of times because it takes a little bit longer to process the information. And I think what happens too is clinicians sometimes will attribute that, the poor cognition, to effects of the HIV. They'll say, oh, maybe they're starting to have some signs of sort of HIV-associated dementia, or so again, they attribute it to that rather than saying this is depression. And depression is highly treatable, and if you treat the depression, you can improve the concentration. But also, I mean, and this is probably the most important to everyone in the room, is our health status and quality of life, right? It's a huge impact on that, and it can be incredibly isolating. It can lead individuals to sort of shy away from socializing, to feel very alone, which can affect their relationships. There have been individuals with chronic depression where it's ended their relationships with their common law partners. It also can affect, if you're isolated, you've lost that sense of community too. So a number of reasons, and there are probably even more than I've included on the page here, reasons to treat. So when we're thinking about treatment for depression, it kind of falls into two categories. So there's behavioral therapy, kind of psychosocial treatment, and then there's the medication treatment. Okay. Now, if someone has a milder form of depression, it may be like that behavioral interventions, kind of psychosocial interventions are enough to treat the illness. Some individuals go on to have more severe depression. They start to feel suicidal. Sometimes the depression is left unnoticed and not treated. It can become so severe that it leads to what we call psychotic depression. If someone is kind of on that end of the spectrum where it's that severe, they will require medications. And in my experience, I think the best case scenario is probably those individuals that are both having medication treatment and therapy. But it's very individual, and it's a conversation to have. There are a number of therapies that have been developed to address depression. So one of the mainstay therapies is cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. It's the one that's most talked about. It's the one that has most research to support it. There is cognitive behavioral therapy for every single mental health condition, including depression. And it works. And so the theory behind cognitive behavioral therapy is that, I'm just going to put this down for a moment and just make a triangle here. So with this triangle, the triangle represents that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all interlinked, okay? And they play into each other. Thoughts, feelings, behaviors, etc. So I'll give you an example of how that works. I get up in the morning, get out of bed, and I stub my toe, okay? I could say to myself, you stubbed your toe, you were half asleep, it's okay, don't be so hard on yourself, carry on with the day, okay? Or I could say to myself, you stubbed your toe, you're an idiot, what were you thinking, the rest of the day is ruined, why even bother, I'm just going to stay in bed, right? So my thoughts in the situation affect my behaviors, which affect my feelings. So in CBT, what we're essentially doing is we're trying to take those like cognitive distortions, okay, that those core beliefs, those negative kind of feelings about ourselves, negative kind of feelings about the world, and we try to modify them or reframe them. So can we interpret it another way? You know, is it that you were an idiot, you weren't paying attention, you stubbed your toe, or is there something else going on here? And if you can modify those cognitive distortions, then what you can do sometimes is actually influence behaviors and feelings. So it's kind of a reframing kind of practice. Interpersonal therapy, or IPT as we call it, it's based on the premise that psychosocial stressors or interpersonal stressors can have a large impact on our mood state. So for instance, if someone has had a loss, bereavement, if someone has had significant transition, a role transition, if there's been a loss of a relationship, right, that can be a trigger for depression or maintain their depression. So in personal therapy, what you're doing is kind of looking at their interpersonal network after they've had one of these major life changes and seeing if you can kind of recreate it. So you've had this loss. Is there others that you can turn to? Is there other ways that you can make connections? MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, is one of the newer therapies, new in the game. I say that a bit, though, tongue-in-cheek, because Buddhism, or Buddhist practices, have been using mindfulness techniques for a number of years, but psychiatry has just kind of jumped on the bandwagon and marketed it and relabeled it and called it a therapy. That being said, though, it is actually a therapy. And it's getting a lot more recognition. So you hear people talk about, oh, I'm mindfully eating, or the slow food movement. I don't know how many people mindfully ate tonight or gobbled up their food. So the premises behind mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is that we have a tendency to kind of get stuck in our thoughts, judge our thoughts, react to our thoughts. And what mindfulness-based therapy says is like, okay, we're not, our thoughts are part of us, but let's take a bit of a step back. Let's kind of observe in the moment in a non-judgmental way. And I'd love to do a mindfulness-based exercise tonight, but I don't know if we'll see if we have time later. Let me give you an example. Because you can apply that not just to be mindful of your thoughts, you can be mindful of your food, mindful of your breathing, mindful of the sensations, right? If we all suddenly for a moment just thought about the sensation of our shoes against our feet. So it's kind of what a mindfulness based therapy is, like taking your attention to the moment, right? Not getting stuck in the past, not worrying about the future, what's present without judgment. If that makes sense. Bullet number 4 there, exercise, yoga, massage. I don't think I have to convince too many people that those lifestyle factors, self-care, are helpful for depression. The interesting thing about massage, there was a study done with adolescents who were HIV positive, and they did 12 weeks of once weekly 1 hour massage. Wouldn't you love to sign up for that study? Free massage every week for an hour for 12 weeks. What's that?
That's covered under medical stores now.
Yeah, we get that already.
Well, then use it, and I'll tell you the reason why. Because what they found in this study, not only did it reduce their risk of depression, improved anxiety, but it also significantly increased their CD4 count. Which is interesting. Now comes the other side. So,
We need to put cannabis in here too. That's all low that problem.
oh, that's a whole other
Don't
talk.
forget
too.
about that.
So, yeah, I've reserved psychotropic treatment for one slide. It's a huge topic. How to sort of summarize my thoughts on this. All right, some take-home points. Okay, yeah, huge topic to talk about. Okay, good news is we have a number of antidepressant medications. Okay, we have a huge toolkit of them. The downside is, and I wish we could do this because it would certainly make my life a lot easier, but I cannot do a blood test or an imaging test and say, you're on this type of antidepressant, you're on this type of antidepressant. It's a bit of trial and error. And you can see, I mean, that'd be frustrating for individuals, right? I'm depressed, and you gotta try a few medications before things get right, and there's no guarantee that the first antidepressant's gonna work. Although, for majority of individuals, the first one does work, about 60 to 70%. And maybe there's a little bit of placebo that goes on with that too, but the other thing to take into consideration is when you're thinking of it, if you require an antidepressant, you want to make sure that you're seeking out a clinician who has experience in the drug interactions with ARBs. Because a number of our antidepressant medications the levels are actually increased by protease inhibitors, ritonavir being the main player. So when you start, you want to start low and go slow. Okay. And there's a little bit more complexities than that. Also, when you find the right antidepressant medication, rejoice. The recommendation is to stay on it for your first episode for at least 6 months. We know that once you have 1 episode of depression, your risk of relapse is about 50%. If you have 2 episodes, 70 to 80%. 3 episodes, up to 95%. So for some individuals, if you've had a number of depressive episodes, you may even want to stay on the antidepressant long term. But that's a discussion to have with the clinician. Some individuals, though, I also see them kind of fall into the situation where, oh, I'm doing really well, I don't think I need to be on my antidepressant anymore, and certainly you can try a trial off of it, but sometimes the depression comes back, and I think that's where that stems from, right? All right. I apologize that this is the one slide I'm affording to anxiety, and it does deserve more. But I can only do so much in a half hour. 20% of persons living with HIV experience anxiety. There's about 5 or 6 different anxiety conditions, but the common ones being generalized anxiety, panic disorder, and PTSD. The good news about anxiety is that it's highly treatable. And in fact, it tends to respond better to therapy than to medications. Not always. If you have, anxiety can be suffocating. Right? If you have severe forms of anxiety, you may require medications. But cognitive behavioral therapy, there's cognitive behavioral therapy for generalized anxiety, PTSD, for panic, and the research shows that it is effective, it does work. And the nice thing about therapy is that medications only work as long as they're in your system. But therapy teaches you tools that you can carry with you for the rest of your life. And CBT is really good for that, teaching a skill set. I'm going to leave it at that. I know it was a bit whirlwind. One thing I will say is that, so I work in the IDC, I work with a team, the IDC mental health team, and that consists of psychiatrists, psychologists, psych nurses, social workers. We provide these therapies. We provide consultation around diagnosis. You can go to your family doctor and get a referral to us. And I would encourage it. And I would encourage even having a conversation about depression, because I think we need to start talking about it and reduce the stigma associated with it. And I think this venue is a starting point. So thank you for allowing me to talk.
Thank you, Dr. Wyde. Some excellent points. Very interesting presentation. Just on the note of massage, I think it's a really great therapy option, and for me, it's worked wonders. So I just wanted to just remind everyone that we do offer massage therapy through Positive Living BC for our members. So currently we have massage therapists in 3 days a week. Both here are available on Mondays, Thursdays, or Fridays. Give our wellness counter a call and book an appointment. So the next speaker tonight is Glenn Townsend. And just a couple of words to introduce Glenn for you. Glenn Townsend was born and raised in Vancouver, and he has been living with HIV since the early 80s. Active in the community, focusing on inclusion of persons with disabilities and human rights. He has served on the board of Positive Living Society of BC from 2002 until 2011, and served as our board chair from 2007 to 2011. He's also been a member of the Canadian Working Group on HIV and Rehabilitation, CWGHR, since 2003, and he served on their board of directors from 2005 to 2015, and as co-chair from 2009 to 2015. His current focus is on HIV and aging, and is the chair of the National Coordinating Committee on HIV and Aging, a project of the CWGHR. So I'd like to welcome Glenn Townsend right now.
Good evening, everyone, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Is it stick? Okay, there you go. So that's who I am. Yeah, we'll just go on here. I just want to acknowledge Positive Living for the opportunity to be here tonight. Also to the Canadian Working Group on HIV and Rehabilitation, commonly known as QUICR to many of you. And the many trusted friends, family, and extremely patient health professionals that have me in the shape I am today. So, I just want to, it's actually really good that Dr. Wyde did more on depression, because I'm going to focus a little bit more on anxiety tonight. And part of it is just for me the journey through the minefields, and I say that because as I was growing up, and this certainly was long before my HIV diagnosis, mental illness is very prevalent in my family. When they say like, 1 in 5, well, I think probably like more than 1 or 2 in my family. And so I grew up around a lot of these issues, but we never talked about mental illness. And a part of it again is that stigma, right, about standing out or being different. And I think it becomes also more complicated when you're living with HIV and then you have another label and another one and another one. So, talking about some of these things can be a little bit uncomfortable. So, going through the minefields here is really trying to actually unpack and define them and see what works for us on an individual basis. So part of that for me is really identifying the issues, like what's going on. Anxiety, for instance, is really common. All of us go through it, and it's a natural part of living. It's when it gets out of control or it starts making our lives unmanageable of where that shift comes from normal levels of anxiety to problems. And again, a lot of that really is about identifying it. Because quite often, especially if we don't have people around us that talk about these things, and with the stigma, we live with these things, and we have all these little problems, and it's like, oh, well, so-and-so has these quirks, and that's just who they are. But the bottom line is there are a lot of things that we can do about it when we recognize them, and when we see what we can actually do about them. So acknowledging that there are situations happening. The other part is accepting help. And I don't know about many of you in the room here, but that has always been a really big issue for me. Actually reaching out and getting that help or asking for it, right? I mean, we should know better. We get to a certain age and, here we go, asking for help again. And the whole point of the matter is we do live in a community and we do rely on each other. But there also has to be a certain level of trust. And as we know with mental illness, people talk, there's the gossip and all the rest of the things. It can be very difficult to open up and actually talk about these issues unless we know we have a safe space in which to do it. So part of that is, in the sense of, is now going to be around moving forward. And so anxiety, and this is a real definition, I love this one, and it's really helpful to think of anxiety like a smoke detector. And one that goes off when it doesn't need to. And I had a great example of that actually this weekend. At 4 o'clock in the morning, my smoke detectors in the house went off, and they're all wired together. So all 4 o'clock in the morning, 2 minutes they're on, and then they went off. And it's like, okay, great. Then they went on again. Then they went off. Then they went on. Everyone in the house is calling each other. It's like, are you cooking toast? What the heck's going on here? And it turned out that one of the alarms had just had a fault. The anxiety around that was unbelievable, because here I am now at 4:30 in the morning, finally figured out which of those detectors isn't working, and unplugging it, but going, oh my God, what if there's something smoldering in the wall that it's telling me about, right? So it's all those extra layers of these things that you can get anxious about. And the bottom line, it turned out to be a defective smoke detector. But that whole process, again, it's that unsettling part. You don't know who to trust. You don't know what's real and what isn't, especially when you're half awake in the middle of the night. So really, what I want to talk about is really finding some useful tools. I'll explain a little incident that happened to me a number of years ago, and it was one of those panic attacks where I could not leave my home. And it happened, there was the set of circumstances which were pretty major events in my life. And I've always kind of thought that I could handle these things, right? My partner had passed away. And, it had been a little bit problematic. He was in the US at that point, and so it was a cross-border thing happening. I just lost my job. And I was also, having some issues around. So I got to a point where I woke up one morning and I could not leave the house. I just could not open that door and leave. And that never happened to me before. So I call it, and I'm having all of these anxious things happening. My heart's racing, I go to the door, it's pounding, I cannot leave that house. And fortunately for me, I did have people in my life that I could call and talk to, and they actually started to walk me through that process. But I could not leave the house for over a week. And then it was even very limited amounts of time. Now, just to put this into context, I've been in care on and off for the last 30 years for depression. So it's not like I don't know about some of these issues, but when these events happen, I had not a clue of what to do. And so fortunately, I was able to get people around me to support me and walk me through those situations, but they're life-altering. I mean, I felt completely crippled. And for the life of me, I could not get out of that box on my own. And I'm really happy that I was able to get the help I needed to do that. But there are times in our lives where we really do need to have professional help. And people around us to support us and not judge us. I don't know, my mother would come over and go, "Get the hell out of the house, what are you doing sitting around, you lazy thing?" And the bottom line is I couldn't have. If someone had tried to drag me out of the house, I was sure I would have had a heart attack or something. I really just could not go. So these incidents do happen. And one of the things that I've found over the years, and partly learning on my own, and then also dealing with the depression, is finding out more about myself and how I react to things. And a lot of that for me was journaling and diaries and just putting notes about what's happening, what's my mood like on a scale of 1 to 10. Am I eating properly? How's my sleep? All of those little things. And tracking over time, I've been able to notice changes where I can actually reach out and get help or talk to other people. So if you think you're facing some of these issues, first it's kind of a good idea to have some information about what is actually happening. And there are a lot of tools out there that are available. And at the end of the presentation here, there's a number of resources, local and national, that can give you just kind of an idea, a toolbox of things to use to start on that journey. So, the website at Anxiety BC is really great. They actually even have a little app that you can download on your phone if you have a smartphone that can actually just go and give you some ideas about where you might want to hone in your thinking. The other part for me is really being able to have a network around me of people that I can actually talk to these things about. And the bottom line is we if we're working and we're busy, there's not always a lot of time to actually sit down and talk about these issues. And then who do you actually talk to about? In the early years, I was very involved in many of the support groups around positive living and other ones. St. Paul's ran a number of support groups. One of the early years was around caregivers of people living with HIV, and that was really useful when my partner was getting very ill. Because for whatever reason, I was diagnosed in '84. I had the positive test come back, but it probably earlier than that, of course, that I contracted HIV. But my partner developed AIDS very quickly. And, I did not, I didn't have any symptoms until I got into the mid-90s when I had an AIDS diagnosis. The thing is as we go through these different challenges and changes, leaving work, changing work, all of those things are very stressful. And those are also things that can trigger episodes of either depression, anxiety. I'll just go on a little bit more about the anxiety because it was a relatively recent incident. And these are just small things, but I have a real issue around law authority and authority figures, and part of that is probably my years of working in the sex trade when you really didn't want police officers around. They just weren't very good company. And to this day, if I'm approached by a police officer, the inside, the alarms are all going off. It's like, what have I done wrong? What are they going to find? And in reality, there's nothing there. I haven't done anything illegal in a long time. Yeah, that's it. And the point being, again, is we have these things underlying inside of us that trigger, but there isn't necessarily any truth to them. So again, taking the time to explore those and find out what's real and what isn't is a really good starting point. Because then at least you have some comparison and you can try using some of the tools to work those things out. So I'm just, the resources and stuff here, if people want to get a copy of these, all of the links are current. I went and checked them. Many of you may have been to some of the other workshops that we've done around depression, and we went into a lot more things around CBT and all those kinds of issues to work on these things. I want to do a little bit more personal tonight because that information we have out there already, and I think the anxiety one is one that is really underplayed a lot. And when we have these situations in our lives, on a regular basis, I just recently turned 54, and I had no idea that I would live past the age of 30. My diagnosis for HIV was in my very early 20s, and it wasn't really expected there was going to be that much time. I can tell you at the age of 30, that entire year was like a bombshell for me. I was constantly waiting for a piano to fall out of the sky, a bus to come off the curb and kill me, because I had no anticipation of living past the age of 30. So, we get all of these new things along the way. This past year, I wound up having to have a very major surgery. And until you know what these things are, living with HIV and all the other complications that we have, last December I wound up with a huge growth at the back of my nose. And my nose was coming out of my face, and so was one of my eyes. Not pretty, and not the face. Anywhere else, but not the face. And it went in, doctor did x-rays, but at that point it's a slow process. And x-rays came back, there's no bone behind your right eye. Better get you sent in for more scans. So, during that time, the level of anxiety that happens, and when we're living with HIV or any kind of chronic illness for any length of time, I think there's a hypersensitivity, or certainly in my own case, of, oh my God, is it that final thing? Well, it turned out to be a large infection from previous surgery I'd had done 24 years ago. Unfortunately, the surgeon at St. Paul's and the entire team there did an amazing job, got everything out, fixed everything up, rebuilt my face, and everything turned out right. But again, during that process, there's all of these things. Where do we get the support? Now, I'm very fortunate. I have some very good family and a lot of friends around me that support me through that process. And also, I was able to look and check on all of these little things that we do to look after ourselves. But some of us aren't that fortunate. It's kind of like we don't all have people to rely on. I think about one of my friends who came to the country here, has absolutely no family, and if something goes wrong, there's no one to reach out to. And so I think it's really important in our community here that we do, start to rely on each other and make those connections and have places where we can safely talk about these issues. I'm not going to talk too much longer because I really would like to have more time for people to ask questions and stuff, but that kind of wraps it up for what I wanted to say on the subject. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn. At this time, I'd like to open up the floor to some questions. Normally, we would have a microphone at the back of the room, so people could go up there. A couple things before we get started. I just want to quickly mention that you have some evaluations on the table for everyone. If you can take a couple of minutes, please, and fill those out, that would be very helpful to us. Just a little bit of insight about your experience here tonight. There should be enough for everyone on the tables. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Lynn and Jennifer to come up to the front, and I will basically, if everyone who has a question can raise your hand, and then I'll ask them because we don't have an extra microphone, to repeat your question and then share their insights to answer you as best they can. So in just a moment, we'll start the questions. You'll be first. Thank you. Hang on a moment.
Is it possible to ask Dr. White to do that exercise, the MBE on the CT?
Yeah.
Is it possible to do the exercise?
If everyone's willing. Who was asked that at the start?
Oh, nobody wants to do it?
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'd like to know
Yeah.
the exercise.
So, what I'll have everyone do is sit in your chair with a relaxed posture. Your back up against the back of the chair, feet on the floor, and hands just resting on your legs. And we'll start first with taking a deep breath. So everyone breathe in and out. So we'll do a breathing exercise. I'm going to bring awareness to your breathing. So I want everyone in the room to think of an air molecule, an oxygen molecule in front of them. And you can assign that air molecule a color. Yellow or red or purple. Any color of the rainbow. And I want you to think about that air molecule as it travels through your body into your lungs. So everyone have their air molecule? So we're all going to take a deep breath in, and we're going to follow that molecule as it has its journey into your lungs. So it's coming in to your nose, into your sinus passages, perhaps, down to the back of your throat, in through your trachea, down into your lungs, all the way to the bottom of your lungs. Floats there for a moment. And then you breathe out. So it makes its way from the bottom of your lungs, up to the top of your lungs, out through your trachea, out through your sinus passages, and out through your nose. And when you're ready, you can open up your eyes and come back. So the idea behind mindfulness is to bring awareness to things that we don't normally bring awareness to. We're a very busy society. We give weight to multitasking, when the reality is that multitasking actually probably is not helpful for us and probably not effective for us. So mindfulness is about bringing awareness to things that you normally wouldn't bring awareness to, and kind of grounding yourself and centering yourself. How many times a day do we stop and actually think about breathing and put an effort into breathing? That's one example. How was it? Yeah.
One of our listeners online has asked a question for Dr. Wide. My understanding is that depression is directly affected by the health of one's gut. HIV attacks the gut and can make it more difficult to digest nutrients. And what is your understanding between HIV, the gut, and depression? Do you see a connection?
not a gastroenterologist. That's kind of not my area. It's not my area of expertise. Certainly in anxiety, there's a high proportion of individuals who suffer from irritable bowel. There seems to be a link to that. I know there are some studies looking at the effects of dietary habits on depression, on anxiety. Some individuals will talk about who have a gluten sensitivity, how if they're not eating healthily, they'll notice changes to their mood state. But I can't quote you any sort of specifics around the link between gut health and depression. I mean, in general, healthy eating, having a well balanced diet, certain lifestyle factors increase your resilience to emotions, and certainly help with the symptoms of depression.
Okay, Margaret?
Thank you, Dr. White, for presenting for us tonight. More and more, we seem to hear that it's difficult to find practitioners or doctors who are willing to treat individuals using talk therapy, and it seems more often than not the medication route is what's happening, and individuals are sort of seen and titrated on a medication, but there's very little psychosocial therapy that's going on. Can you respond to that and give your perspective on that?
My quick answer is yes. You're right. There is resource pressures. There's lack of funding. There is, psychiatry is an underserviced profession. I think it's easier to fill out a script. It takes more effort, it takes more time to do therapeutic piece. I can go on a little bit of a soapbox about this too, because I think that more money should be funneled into therapeutic programming. Even my time in the IDC is more kind of around diagnostic medication and consultative role. I do therapy in some of my other roles. We've tried in the IDC to also have some group-based work. So there is mindfulness-based or meditation, there is cognitive behavioral and the Changed Ways program. But it is a bit of a dying breed, the psychiatrist that does therapeutic work. They do exist out there. I think there also seems to be a push these days towards group-based follow-up, which it has its benefits too, because you get to kind of have that shared experience. But yeah, I agree with you. There unfortunately has been, I think the easier route sometimes is the medication route, but it's not always the right route. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for probably one more question. It's just about 8:30, and so I'll pass it back to you over here.
Actually, I have a couple of questions. The first one is in line with what Elgin says. I think there's not enough of the social support myself. Going through depression recently, I had to resort to go to HIM, Health Initiative for Men, which a lot of HIV people won't go because they don't want to divulge their HIV status. So again, you're limited. The CBT group at St. Paul's is full, so you have to be on the waiting list, so there should be more of that. And that's unfortunate that there's not enough. And I was thinking that maybe Positive Living in BC could look at something like that. It's not duplicating what HIM is doing or what St. Paul's IBC is doing, but it's geared towards men and women with HIV. The other question, Dr. White, what is a long-term medication treatment? A year, 2 years, lifetime?
It depends on depends on many factors. Depends on the diagnosis, depends on the person, it depends on how many episodes they've had. If I have an individual who I'm seeing and they've told me that they've had recurrent episodes of depression, I may suggest to them to stay on their medication lifelong. Right? Just kind of weighing risk benefits of coming off the medication. Or if they're going to come off the medication, be careful that it's done with the advice of a clinician, and that it's done in a gradual way with medical check-ins to make sure for any emerging signs of depression. So I can't give you kind of a one answer for all.
Okay, thank you very much. Was there one more question over here? All right. One last over here.
Yeah, I had a comment that actually addresses the individual that was online, and that is the fact that both the gastrointestinal specialist that I had and my GP never really determined what caused this. So in 2005, I ended up with ulcerative colitis, and the reason was manifold, I guess, lots of stress. My job was coming to an end all at once. I didn't know what my diagnosis was yet, so it's in the process of getting that tested. And so job loss was coming up, I had issues at home, and so I was totally stressed out. Lost 30 pounds in 30 days. I ate normal, I did all my own cooking mostly, so I didn't eat junk food, so I was eating healthy, yet my body wasn't taking the nutrition and applying it, and I was already HIV. So the fact is that my health just went down like crazy. So does stress and gut flora or lack thereof affect your moods and or how the medications work with your body? Yeah, I believe so, because it took me 18 months to work my way back up.
Comments from Glenn or Dr. Watt?
Just on the gut flora issue, there are a lot of studies happening and in process now around gut flora and its effect on our health, our moods, etc. I mean, the one big study that's going on right now is, with childbirth and natural childbirth versus C-section, and the problem with C-section with the child not getting properly bathed in the mother's bacteria and actually getting natural flora in them, because baby, when it comes out, is kind of a blank slate. So I think there's a lot of preliminary work, and there seems to be, there was a report on the CBC this week about, gut flora. Maybe, the next new diet isn't going to be about, a new diet program, but actually figuring out what flora is in your gut. So, there is a lot of work happening right now, but to date, I don't know of any specific, concrete connections.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have just one last question from the online audience, and then we'll wrap it up for tonight. Thank you very much, and I'll make just a couple of quick announcements at the end too.
Could Dr. Wyde please expand on the genetic influence on depression?
So there's always been that, historically, that debate, nature versus nurture, right? So to what extent do our genes versus our environment affect outcomes? And so there's an area, a research area, epigenetics, which talks about the role that environment has on genes. So we're finding that, and this maybe relates to diet, like certain diets can affect the way that genes are expressed. So there's this kind of push towards like this gene by environment interaction. Genetics has a role to play, as I said, about 30 to 50%, but that's kind of half the battle, right? So we really need to consider trauma history, stress history when we're thinking about depression. That being said, and as we were talking about, Glenn, if there's a family history of depression, it certainly increases your risk. So genetic component is there, but it's not the whole story. And I don't know if they're wanting to know more about that study in particular.
No, I think they just wanted to.
Oh, just kind of, yeah. Yeah, I don't want to give the impression that genetics is all. Genetics plays a component, but environment is important too. And I guess along that line too, sometimes what I'll do is, if an individual has depression and a family member has had depression and or anxiety, sometimes what we find is if a family member has responded to a particular antidepressant, chances are that individual will respond to that antidepressant. So there's also kind of genetic component to the way individuals respond to treatment or psychotropic treatment, which is interesting too. The same applies for diagnosis of bipolar. If individuals have been on one, family members on one route, a lot of you tend to use that one. It's complex.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. We've got a little bit over time. All I want to say is that before we go, I'd like to thank our guest speakers, Dr. Jennifer Wyde from St. Paul's Hospital, and former Positive Living Society of BC Chair, Mr. Glenn Townsend. I'd also like to thank our pharmaceutical sponsors, AbbVie, Gilead, Janssen, Merck, and Vive Shire for their generous support for this event. And also a thank you to the Chateau Granville for the lovely dinner and the venue. And on behalf of the Positive Living Society of BC, I would like to thank all of you for joining us tonight. Thank you very much. Hopefully you have a wonderful evening, and looking forward to seeing you all again.